I can hear myself, yes. It's a bit disconcerting.
It is strange, isn't it, when you haven't done it before? Yeah. So it picks up lots of sound, like that type of thing as well. So we'll just try and, even like when you pick up the glass and put it down, it actually makes quite a big sound. So just, in fact, why don't we have this?
Yeah, good thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an issue. And sometimes people walking by outside, it'll hear a tiny, tiny thing. But basically, it's picking up the sound here.
Okay.
So it should be fine.
Okay.
And as we're talking, if I feel like it's not loud enough, I might reach over and kind of push it towards you.
Okay.
But basically, we want our voices to sound a similar level.
Okay.
Because it's just easier. And
yeah.
So that's what we do.
Okay.
I think we're ready to go. When I introduce with the PhD, do I just say that you're studying your PhD or a candidate for PhD? I'm not familiar with the correct way.
PhD candidate is usually, I think, the way most people would say it. So,
in psychology?
In psychology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
You can say organizational psychology if you'd like. Either way is correct.
That's fine. Well, I'll say, whichever way you want is fine. That's all good. All right, so it's a real pleasure to welcome Natasha Zimmerman, who's the founder of Unchatter and is a PhD. So that's the other thing, is we can edit it later. If I make a mistake or if you make a mistake, don't worry.
Oh, good. That's a huge relief.
I know. It doesn't have to be perfect the whole way through.
Okay, good.
So organizational psychology.
Yeah.
PhD student, do you say, or
student
candidate?
Or candidate, either way is fine. Yeah.
All right. And who is a PhD candidate in organizational psychology. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
It's wonderful to have you on the show because I know what you're doing and you're involved in with Unchatter. It strikes a lot of things that are resonating for me in my life, and this idea of coming together and having community. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important in the world we are today. But before we get into that and talk about why you've started Unchatter and sort of what it is and sort of the reasons for it, what I love to do with guests is go back in time. So we're just going to time travel to the start of your life, and I'd love to hear a little bit about where you're from, and then we'll kind of build up the picture to paint, why is it that you do what you do today? Yeah. So where are you from?
Okay, well, I suppose the easiest answer to that is I grew up on a farm in North Dakota in America. And I actually, as a fan of your podcast, I've heard you ask other people this question. And so I brought something to maybe broaden my answer to this question, which is a little poem that I wrote. And this is inspired by one of Brene Brown's practices where she has people write a poem called I Am From, or starting with that I am phrase. So
great, I love
if you'd
that.
like to,
let's start a new tradition here.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
All right. And I think this encompasses a bit more of who I really am beyond just the geographical origin. So here we go. I am from frigid 6-month winters and the abiding awe of snowfall, from harvest time suppers in dusty fields and the clean, clean earth of mud-soaked country roads. I am from oceans away and here. I am from America, but not this one. I belong everywhere I've ever been. I am from stacks and stacks of dog-eared books, from abandoned umbrellas and the golden hour. I am from poetry and cello music, from furrowed brows and furrowed fields. I am from kisses by starlight and broken hearts by daylight. I am from knowingness and mystery. I am from the certainness of the sacred. I am from my grandpa's galoshes and gentle shoulder squeezes. I am from the strong hands of my grandmothers, made of sterner stuff than me. I am from big questions and small ones too. And I am from the loveliest of all human acts, the soft soul bow of inhabiting this moment with you.
How wonderful. What a great way to start the podcast.
Thank you
so much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, that's great. Well, there's lots of little hints there of where you're from and what shaped you. I love the references to your grandparents.
Yes.
That stuck out to me. Did they play a big role in your life, in your childhood, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So my grandparents on my father's side were on a farm just 7 miles from where I grew up. So we saw them, if not daily, certainly weekly, and they were very influential in my life. And my grandfather on that side passed away in 2003, but he's who I consider to be my hero in life. And he had just this very gentle and simple way of living life that I still look to as something that I aspire to in my own life. And so that certainly has been a tremendous guiding influence for me. And my grandmother as well on that side. She actually just passed away this month. So I've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about how much they have played a role in who I've become today and how grateful I am for that influence, because I know it's not something that everyone has. And my grandmother on my mom's side also had a very close relationship with her as well, and she's still with us, thankfully. So yeah, I feel tremendously grateful for everything that they've taught me and the parts of me that have made me who I am today.
Yeah, it shows the power of a grandparent in a child's life, doesn't it? When you think about all that you've been through and then this new baby's born and it's your grandchild, like it's just such a special bond that for better or worse, where we live now in Western society, I think there is a bit of a disconnect between generations that maybe in the past there wasn't, because the grandparents lived 7 miles down the road or whatever. And it's something I definitely worry about, for my own kids, that their grandparents unfortunately are across an ocean. So they don't have that sort of day-to-day interaction. But it sounds like that was a big part of your childhood then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something really precious about that role that they play, because it's something that can't quite be filled by anyone else in your life. Parents obviously take on a different role. Even aunts and uncles and people like that just don't quite fill that same function in life. And so I think there's something really sacred about that. And, I have memories of playing on my grandparents' farm, and they had these beautiful apple trees in their yard, and we used to, my cousins and I, go and climb those trees, and my grandma would always tell us, don't eat too many apples or you'll spoil your supper, and somehow every single time we did the same thing. We climbed all the way up to the top to get the good ones, and by the time we came in for supper, we were stuffed with those
full of apples.
Tart little apples. Yes. So lots of really sweet memories like that have been a really fundamental part of my growing up years and who I've become.
Yeah, that's really special. Yeah, obviously my kids are still, in primary school, but one day if I did have grandchildren, I've often thought, wouldn't it be special to be able to take, like if your grandchild was turning 10 or something, take them on a trip, just you and your grandchild, and like feed into them in a way that, like you say, no one else has that permission. No one else has that relationship.
Yeah.
Really
I think
good.
There's something really beautiful about some of those family relationships, even outside the immediate family unit. And I've thought about that with my nieces and nephews as well. And I did start a little tradition like that you mentioned, and took my niece on a trip. She was 6 at the time. So last summer, I took her to the ocean for the first time.
Wow.
Growing up in North Dakota, obviously a landlocked state.
Yep.
And so I gave her a choice of a few different places we could visit, and she wanted to go see the ocean, and it was just, it was a really, really enlightening and very special experience for me, and hopefully for her as well. So something really special there.
I'm sure it'll be memorable, right? The first time she saw the ocean with you. That's really cool. So just let's turn back though, because the poems help to. I love poetry, as you know, but it's given us a really, I guess, I would call it maybe an impressionistic painting. So fill in a little bit more of the detail. Like, what sort of things did you enjoy when you were 5 or 6 years old, for example? What sort of a child were you?
Yeah. Well, I was very quiet and thoughtful as a child, and also very obedient. So I wasn't one to color outside the lines or try to break the rules. And sometimes when I reflect on my personality and who I was as a child. I wish I would have been more of that renegade child, because those were the types of characters that I admired in books. But for me, it just felt more natural to have this kind of quiet, reflective existence, even as a child. And I was always very eager to make people around me feel joyful and at peace in some way. And I think that was something that when I think back on that time in my life now, I can see that in the stories that I hear my parents tell about how I was as a child. And I was also a big reader, so certainly books were my way of escapism, as they are for many kids, I think, of that age. And also loved being outside, and that's something that has really stayed with me to this day as well.
Yeah, and you kind of hinted there at North Dakota, it gets pretty cold in the winter, right?
Yes.
Like, but real contrast to summer, is that right? Like,
it
gets
quite a bit. Yeah. So winters are quite frigid, sub-zero Fahrenheit temperatures pretty consistently. And I mentioned, 6-month winters, and that's not really an exaggeration. Usually the first snowfall comes around, October, November, and doesn't really start to melt until April. So, so it's a long stretch, and I think that's part of the reason I love winter so much now, is that you either learned to love it and embrace it and find ways to see the joy, or else you were going to be miserable 6 months of the year. Right. So for me, it was an easy choice. Make the best of it.
Yeah, definitely. And so coming up sort of through your, primary school, young age, did you have an area or thing that you enjoyed? It sounds like reading and writing was your thing, or yeah, just describe yourself for us.
Yeah, definitely reading and writing. I remember when I got my first journal, I was in 4th grade, and I can still see it in my mind. It was this little pink journal. It had a cat ballerina on the front and a little lock, which to me made it a real journal, because I could actually, create this combination so it would lock and no one else could see it.
Yeah,
I had all kinds
special.
of deep 4th grade thoughts that went in that journal. So I think that was what really cemented my process of reflecting on what I was seeing happen in the world around me. And perhaps I was maybe different than most kids in that way, where I was very much an observer. So even, if I were to read back some of those journal entries from those early years now, it was quite interesting, I think, to see a lot of gratitude and just noticing little things, certainly in a childlike way, but that was very present, I think, even as a kid. And there's a sensitivity that comes along with that. I think that's something that perhaps my parents, especially my mom, struggled with, how exactly to address that I seemed to feel very deeply and be impacted by what others were thinking and feeling, and really take that on in a deep way.
Oh, that's good. Well, it's always interesting to just trace a person's character and shape, and of course, nature versus nurture. It sounds like quite a lot for you is sort of coming out from who you were just naturally, whether you'd been born in a beach, or in a snowy place. Maybe it would have been the same. Yeah. So coming through high school and things, like, I know you're studying organizational psychology now. Was this, how do people interact? How do we make decisions? Like, was that something even in your high school years that was interesting to you, or?
It was, but probably not in the same way that it is to me now. I think a lot of it was born around that time from feeling different myself, and a bit of a black sheep in my family. And as much as I appreciate now the way that I grew up and being raised on a farm, I think there were a lot of things about that upbringing that at the time I felt like just didn't fit me. I had this desire to spread my wings and see other places and travel, and perhaps part of that came from books and knowing there was this big world out there that I really wanted to explore and to experience in a different way. So I think that's perhaps where some of the first seedlings of that started, is that feeling different and noticing how other people interacted and what other experiences were like or could possibly be like. So,
So was it quite a small town, or was it
a
movie type of scene of its small town with farms around and
Absolutely.
getting the bus to school. And
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
quite idyllic in that sense, and I certainly have more appreciation for it now. But the farm I grew up on, we were about 30 miles or so from the town where I went to school.
Yeah.
So we rode the bus, and then once my older brother got his driver's license, he was able to drive us. So that made a bit of a difference. But yeah, the town that was closest to us, the population was maybe 1,500 people. I graduated in a class of about 40. So definitely a very small setting to grow up in.
Everyone knows everyone.
Absolutely, yes.
And potentially what your grandfather did to this person is also known,
Yes.
like there's deep memory in towns like that, isn't there?
Yeah, a lot of association with, family names. And if you have siblings who are around your age, it's, you can't go to school without teachers kind of associating your way of being with your siblings, and for better or for worse. And, so that's definitely the thing where there's no secrets in a small town.
Yeah. So you get you're in high school. Did you know then that you wanted, like we're here in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty far away. Did you know at that point that you wanted to explore the world, that you wanted to get out of the small town environment? And I ask that because my father grew up in a small town in California, and he's told me that for him, when he got to the end of high school, he was like, I'm out of here, and basically never returned in the same way. He went back to visit, but I'm just curious what was your feeling as you approached your high school, end of high school?
I would say my experience was similar to your dad's in that I was quite eager to get out and experience more, and not because I had any resentment towards the way that I grew up or my family. I loved them all dearly and had good relationships and all of that. It was more just that, that chomping at the bit a little bit to see what else was out there. And as far as traveling the world, I think at that time, I didn't really even have a sense that was a possibility. To me, spreading my wings looked like going to Minnesota, which is where I got my undergraduate degree, and, visiting other states. That was really the breadth of my imagination at that point. So it wasn't until I started to experience more of the world and meet other people that I think my sense of possibility really broadened even further.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It very often is what you know is what you know, and until you're exposed to other people and other ways of doing things, you can stay a little bit trapped in your own paradigm. So what did you end up studying? Let's move through like university years. What were you studying? Yeah,
so my bachelor's degree was in social work and sociology, and then I also had a minor in gerontology because I always really enjoyed being around older people. I think because I'm a bit of an old soul myself, I just always felt really at home with that population, and so I really wanted to work in that realm of social work. And
interesting. Yeah. So what do they teach you in gerontology? Is there a course? I mean, what are the main topics that you're learning about? Yeah,
so some of it was looking at that time, what was shifting in terms of population dynamics. So as the baby boomers were aging, looking at what were some of the things that we could expect and what would the impacts be on nursing homes, for example, and how would that change career opportunities for people. So some of it was kind of the future of aging, if you will, and what that might look like. And then there were also pieces about, socializing. So how does socializing look different as you age, and what are some of the physical challenges that can contribute to mental health issues like depression and things like that. So it was quite because it was just a minor at that point, it wasn't even an option to get a major or a degree in gerontology. It was really just my way of more deeply exploring something I was really interested in.
Yeah. It's a fascinating area, isn't it? Because for better or worse, our society often gets like, okay, you've retired, boom, completely different. You're not working anymore. Here's your watch, and the reality is that it can be a difficult transition for people to go from having worked for 40 years or whatever to what do I do? Do I have value? How do I contribute?
And I think if we look at so many of the things that we know now about what makes us happy and what makes us feel fulfilled as human beings. So much of the psychology research points to purpose and meaning and relationships, and so much of that is taken away, I think, when retirement happens. So some of those connections that were perhaps forged at work maybe fall away. Certainly, sense of purpose and meaning can be altered significantly. And so when we look at rates of depression and things like that amongst people who are 65 and older, I think that's where a lot of that comes from. But I think it's also going to shift significantly as the way that we look at work changes as well, where it won't be, I would estimate, this is just my prediction, that, as my generation, for example, comes to what we now call retirement age, that we won't approach it in the same traditional way, that we've come to look at work more as sort of a lifelong endeavor, and we want to be doing things that mean something to us throughout the span of a life, and not just go put in 8 hours or a designated amount of time doing something that doesn't necessarily fill that deeper meaning for us.
But it's a good reminder for people, I think, because those first 2 months, 3 months when you've retired, they're going to be fantastic, because you're going to go golf every day if you want to. You're going to drive around and see things that you've never been able to see. But at the end of that 2 or 3 months, it's going to, I imagine it's going to be like, okay, well, what day is it? Is it a Wednesday or a Saturday? Anyway, the point is the routines would get totally thrown out, which is one of the reasons I'm doing the podcast in preparation of one day retiring, right? Because this is something I could continue on for a very long time, potentially, if I keep enjoying it. But having a diverse range of interests, before you hit the retirement date, I think that would be a real strategy to make sure that it wasn't such a huge transition.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant way of looking at it. And really, I think what you said is such a great reminder that ultimately it's up to all of us to create our own lives. And I think sometimes we forget that we're not victims of circumstance, that, whether it's retirement or the way our day-to-day life looks right now, that we are the ones who can be the architects of what that life looks like. And so it's not as if someone else is taking away our purpose or our fulfillment or our joy or gratitude. Those are all things that we have the ability to cultivate ourselves. And I think the more agency that we feel in that, the happier we'll be. And there's some research that would suggest that's true as well.
Well, it makes sense, doesn't it? But I think you're right. Sometimes we feel like there's no agency, that it's not my responsibility, that somehow we'll be handed it on a plate. And the reality is, as we know, usually there's a lot of hard work or a lot of effort to get to something. So, oh, that's really good. So you get to the end of that undergraduate study. Did you know what you wanted to do next, or what happened? What happened next?
So I actually did get a job pretty much right out of university as a social worker in a nursing home, and really enjoyed that because it was exactly what I was hoping to do with my degree. But I found that I got disillusioned with it rather quickly, because as much as I enjoyed the one-to-one interaction, there was also this itch that I had to have an impact on a broader scale. And that's what eventually led me to the leadership world and trying to get more into that realm, because I felt like it was an area where I could have a larger sphere of influence, and that was something that really started to become important to me. So, so after I kind of started out in the nursing home social work area, I moved across the country to Cleveland, Ohio, and started working there for a healthcare consulting company. And initially was still doing that one-to-one work with individuals who were 65 or older, typically low income, and had some difficult life circumstances. And we were trying to help them get signed up for certain government programs and things like that could provide some additional assistance. But after just about 6 months there was a leadership opportunity that came along, and I didn't even really have the presence of mind at that time to see myself in that kind of a role. But through the encouragement of my boss at the time and some of the other people who were around me, I decided to apply and ended up getting that position. And that was the start of my leadership journey, which I think really transformed my career in a lot of ways.
Right. Interesting. So what do you think it is? Like, I love it when people can't see themselves in a position and it takes someone else outside helping them to go, no, you should apply for it. Like, what was it, that person who helped you to do that? Yeah, tell me about them a little bit. What do you think that what was their approach or their attitude? Was it consistent that they looked for opportunities for other people? Or
Yeah, so the person who encouraged me, she actually is still a very good friend of mine. And so I think I would say that she certainly does see that in other people as well. But also some of it was, I was a good technician, if you will. I was good at the mechanics of the job, but also had, I would say, a bit of a sort of an even-keeled approach to things. So when you're doing direct social work in that way and working one-on-one with people, especially when it's over the phone and a high volume and people are in often difficult situations, it can become stressful relatively quickly. But I think just maintaining enough of a sort of calm and professional demeanor, but still coupled with compassion, was something that that she really saw potential in. So I'm extremely grateful that she was able to recognize that, and also that she had cultivated a relationship with me in a way that made me really eager to listen to her and actually take that advice and decide to go for it.
That's great. So what's her name?
Her name is Joy.
Joy. Well done, Joy.
Yes.
Hopefully she'll listen to this. Because
Yes.
I love to call out people who played that role as an encouragement to me. Who around me could I be playing that role for?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, because I don't want to just leave it there for everybody who's listening. I mean, where are the opportunities that you see for someone who can't see it in themselves?
Absolutely.
How can you help them to grow in that way? I think it's
Yeah.
really, that's, if we give nothing else back in our lives, like if we can help other people on their journeys, then we've accomplished something, right?
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think we actually underestimate the impact that can have. And, you see so many stories of people who talk about, my second grade teacher told me I was a good writer, and that's why I'm a writer today. And I think it's not often that we actually take the time to reflect on those individual people in our lives who have really unfurled this whole chain of events that has led us to where we are. So hopefully Joy will listen to this and know what an impact just that, that one little bit of encouragement had in many ways getting me where I am today. And there were, many other people along the way as well. But it's, I think, quite a powerful reminder of just how impactful that can be.
Definitely. Well, Joy, she's here in New Zealand now. There you go. So, and the other word that strikes me that we haven't said yet, but I have to say it, is empathy. That being empathetic and kind of seeing the world through other people's eyes, and therefore seeing their potential. I think that has a lot to be said for it as well.
Yeah.
So you take on this first role, and just describe, I guess, the first steps that you took in that leadership role, but then also I'm really curious about what you're studying now and the idea of organizations and psychology.
Yeah.
So I'd love to dive deep into that for a while. And also I want to get to Unchatter. So just kind of bring us up, I guess, to how you got into what you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So during those first few months in a leadership role, I was obviously quite young at that time, and one of my personality traits that has at times served me well and other times really tripped me up is that I am quite a perfectionist, and it's very important to me to do things extremely well. And so I think at that time I felt a bit unprepared. It was something I hadn't expected really in the first place. And so to find myself in that position where I was supervising people who had been peers, most of whom were older than I was, I thought, my goodness, I really need to figure out how to do this the right way.
Right.
And so I started diving into books, and podcasts weren't really a thing at that time, but just searching for all the information I could find. Really grabbed on to cultivating relationships with people that I considered to be mentors in the leadership space, and just really became a sponge and also started experimenting with a lot of different things. So the whole positive psychology field was really just sort of becoming a thing at that time. So I was reading a lot of those books and a lot of books about business leadership. So Malcolm Gladwell was one of my favorites, of course, Stephen Covey. So all of those kind of classic business leadership books, I just devoured those and then started getting more into the positive psychology realm as well. And I think the consequence of that was that not only did I learn a lot about leadership, but I learned a lot about self-leadership and how to cultivate self-awareness and learn more about myself in ways that would ultimately help me interact and connect more meaningfully with other people.
Right. Yeah. That's really good. Yeah. Because there's so much out there that we don't know, right?
Yeah.
But I agree with you. If you can take a bit of time and just go a bit deeper into some of those principles, it has huge impact.
Yeah.
So that's what sort of got you into thinking about studying again and, I want to learn more, or?
Yeah, exactly. So I actually went back and got my master's degree while I was still working. And I got my master's in public administration because again, thinking from sort of that holistic perspective, I thought, maybe I want to be in politics and actually influence things at a more macro level even than where I was. So that seems to have been a trend, I think, during my early career, is of really thinking about how can I have a larger footprint in terms of impacting people in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And then as I continued to move up the ladder at that organization, obviously had more and more responsibility and was very fortunate to have an excellent boss who gave me a lot of autonomy. And that, combined with everything that I was reading and what I had studied in my master's program, led me to start doing a lot of experimentation in what I didn't realize at the time was actually organizational psychology.
Okay.
So there were things I was reading about in research articles and books that I was reading, and just ideas that I had, kind of percolating on my own as well. And I thought, how can I take this environment that is at my fingertips for these, 100 or so people who are under my leadership and make this a really joyful and meaningful space. And this image I had in my mind was that, when someone's alarm clock went off in the morning, I wanted them to think, oh, yes, I get to go to work today. And understanding that, of course, there's always the, kind of yucky administrative stuff and the elements of our jobs that no matter how joyful it is, that we don't necessarily like. So understanding that's sort of part and parcel of the work that we do. But in the larger scheme of things, how could we really make this a joyful place for people to be? And so there were different initiatives that I implemented, also had a dynamite leadership team who really helped me push a lot of those things through, and then did a lot of tracking along with it to see, did it bear out in the results in terms of, productivity and revenue, which is, of course, what the executives were really interested in, but also some of the softer things like engagement and just what was the feeling, when you walked through our wing of the building, what did it feel like? Were people happy to be there? And that became such a driving force to really create this incubator of happiness, if you will.
Yeah, that's great. So just reflecting back on that time, what would you say were some of the successful experiments, and what was the direct results that came out of them?
Yeah, so probably my favorite, if I had to choose, would be a gratitude initiative that I started. And this was originally born from a talk it was a TED Talk actually by a psychologist named Sean Acor, and it's called The Happy Secret to Better Work.
Okay.
And I actually showed the video in one of my team meetings, and he talks about how we really have it backwards when we think about the success of organizations. So we often think, if we can get people to achieve their goals, they'll be happy and have a sense of fulfillment at work. When actually it's the opposite. If we can make them feel happy and fulfilled, that's ultimately what breeds success. And I loved that idea. It made such perfect sense to me. And so what we know based on the research and what I knew even from my own practice is that part of what lends itself to happiness is gratitude. And so I started this initiative called 21 Days of Gratitude, where each day a different team came into my office and we just had a stand-up meeting and everyone talked about one thing that they were grateful for. And it could be something personal, it could be something professional. It was up to them what it was that they wanted to share. And initially it was really about the gratitude, but as we looked at the impact that it had, it became so much more than that. It was, I think for me, as I was a director at that time, and, with, 100 plus people, it was really important to me to know something personal about everyone and to have a sense that I was familiar with them and what was important to them, but that's difficult to do with that number of people. And so it was a way for me to hear little snippets of what was happening in people's lives and to be able to use that as a reference point in connecting with them. So it was really powerful in that way. And I think the other perhaps more obvious output was that it really did start to do what the research says it will do, which is that it rewires people's brains to scan for the positive. So I'll just share one little story that always stood out to me as sort of the shining example of why it was a success. So one morning we're having our good things meeting, and one of our associates comes in and she's kind of, huffing and puffing and a little bit late and sort of flustered. And we finally get around to her and she's like, I had the worst morning ever. It was raining outside and I got a flat tire, and it just seemed like one of those days where everything was going wrong. And she's like, as I sat there waiting for my dad to come and help fix my flat tire, I thought, oh gosh, and now I have this good things meeting when I get into work, and what am I going to share when, I'm having this miserable morning? And she said, all of a sudden I thought of all the things that I had to be grateful for in this situation, that I had a car that could even get a flat tire, that I had a job that I was trying to get to, that I had bosses and a team who would be understanding, that I'm provided for, and I had someone who could actually come and help me. And she's like, all of a sudden, I had this burst of happiness at all these things that were so wonderful about my life, and all because of that flat tire. And so that's ultimately what gratitude is about, is teaching us to scan our environment for those things that are going right, even though that's not necessarily our natural state of being.
Yeah,
so
it makes sense. So an attitude of gratefulness
absolutely
is something that can be cultivated, rather than one-off sort of, oh, that's nice.
Yes.
But actually looking for the positive. Yeah, there's so much there. I think even for me, just this past weekend, TEDx Christchurch was on.
Yes.
So I was volunteering there, and I was kind of at the front, like welcoming people, welcome to TEDx. Good to see you. Good morning. Welcome. Come on this way. Yeah. But the way that I greeted, like you could see the faces changing as you smiled, as you welcomed them, and it was just this realization that very often I forget this, and there's real power in our body language, in how we treat people and how often we smile, and actually if you have the attitude of being welcoming all the time, not just because you're there at the front, welcoming people to an event, it actually, it's like something that can be trained and you can learn. And it was just amazing seeing like literally hundreds of people, and they would be walking towards me, maybe not smiling or anything, and you just go, hi, welcome to TED, and their attitude back would be a similar, gratitude, joyful type of attitude. It's it's powerful stuff. Yeah,
there's actually, there's a bit from the research that's really interesting around that, where we have something called mirror neurons, and it's basically what makes us as human beings mimic the people who are around us.
Right.
And obviously with long-term connections, it has even more impact. But even in the short term, we see this from the time that we're babies. That's why we smile and, make googly eyes at babies, because they're connecting with us and they're mirroring what it is that we do. And when Toni Morrison passed away recently, I saw an article where she had done an interview with Oprah, I believe, years and years ago. And she was talking about children, and she said the most important thing with a child that they look for in you is, do you light up when they walk in the room? And I just thought that was such a beautiful and simple way of framing it. And at the same time, I thought, but it's not just children. We all want that. Think of how amazing it feels when you walk into a room or you pass someone, or, you walk into a building or an event and someone has that, almost entire body joy of seeing you. And it's just such an incredible feeling. And we have an opportunity to do that and gift that to people in every single interaction that we have.
Yeah. Which, of course, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
So the encouragement to the listener is, how are we interacting with the people in our lives?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's so true, and we know it, but it's easy to forget, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's a great example. I love that attitude of gratefulness. It's something we try to encourage with our children. Like having dinner, like let's go around the table. What's one thing that happened today that you're grateful for?
Yes,
and just trying to get them to verbalize. Well, I read a book, or played a game, or whatever it is. But that starts that, doesn't it? That cultivation of a grateful attitude.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, like what you're doing with your children, it's also a lens into someone's way of being and seeing what's important to them, because the things that one person might be grateful for and pick up on in their environment might be completely different than someone else's. And so I think that's the other way that it's a really beautiful connector, is it shows you what's important to someone.
And like you say, it deepens the relationship with the people who are sharing about, I just got a new dog and it's my pet, and all of a sudden you've got a connection point, right? Like, hey, how's your dog doing? And, that's really good. And I think as well, we're riffing on this quite a lot. We'll move on in a minute, but I like to go, if it's there, we go there. My great-grandfather, his name was Robert Conrad, and when he was about 65, he went blind. And he never, the family story goes, I wasn't born yet, the family story goes that he didn't complain about this awful thing that had happened to him. He had somehow nurtured through his life the attitude that he would be grateful for whatever circumstance he was in. So, like, if I lost my sight, I would probably be complaining. But he had this attitude of, I'll learn to walk with a cane. I'll continue with my life. And I think, but the point is, I think he had cultivated an attitude of gratefulness. That moment wasn't nothing. It had been a lifetime to build to that. Yeah. And so for each of us, that challenge is there, I think, as well.
Absolutely. And I think it gets back to what we were saying about agency and this idea that ultimately we all have the ability to cultivate something like that. And there's something in the psychology research called the happiness set point that basically says, we all sort of have this equilibrium of happiness that we're born with, that's genetic, if you will. And that just is what it is. But the larger part of our happiness and our sense of well-being is something that we can influence, whether it's through creating an environment that makes us joyful or practicing gratitude, all those kinds of things. There's so much that's in our control in terms of creating a life and a mindset that ultimately is, a servant to us instead of a master.
Yeah, that's great. So you're working and you're diving deep and you're studying, you get your master's. Maybe just bring us up to speed, like we're here in New Zealand.
Yes.
What happened next? How did you end up deciding, I want to really study this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got to a point in that organization where I knew there wasn't much further I could go, and I was quite ambitious and wanted to keep moving up the ladder. And so an opportunity came along to shift to another healthcare organization that was much larger, one of the largest for-profit healthcare organizations in the U.S. And it was an executive position, so I was able to move into a vice president role there. And to me, it really aligned with my goals at that time of, again, expanding that sphere of influence and being able to take some of these initiatives and things that I had implemented and put into practice in one organization and saying, okay, are they going to translate to another larger environment in quite a different setting? And so it was a really exciting time, I think, to be able to take some of those concepts and see what's the transferability here, because I think often that's the ultimate test of a concept, is to see, can it live outside this little incubator that you created it in? So So I shifted to that organization and was there for a little over 3 years and really appreciated my time there. But it also is what ultimately moved me in the direction of stepping away from the corporate world. And I think operating in an organization of that size really brought into focus what it was about leadership that I enjoyed, and having some of those aspects taken away, in a sense, in a much larger setting, really brought that into light in a different way. So I got to a place where I knew I wanted to make a shift, because when I thought, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? And if I work my way up to, CEO or whatever position that I ultimately want to get to in this type of environment, is that going to feel like a good use of my years?
Right.
And nothing against that organization. Like, I had wonderful experiences there, but ultimately I thought, no, there's something else in me that needs to make its way into the world. And I had also started traveling more at that time while I was still working. So had spent some time in Europe, had gone to Bali. And I think anytime you travel and you get yourself outside of your day-to-day environment, you just can't help but really have your mind and your imagination stretched.
Yeah.
And so those experiences and meeting people who had done a lot of traveling and were just doing really unique and cool things in the world got my gears turning. And so I started to work out whether it was possible for me to leave the corporate world and take some time off just to explore and to travel and to think about what it was that I really wanted to do next. So I did that. The end of 2017, I left that organization, and my intent was to take all of 2018 to just travel and do some of this exploration. So I did I feel like it's kind of becoming cliched now, but, sold my house and my car and all my stuff and just hit the road and did some traveling. And just a few months into that, I started having this little percolation of an idea of, I've always wanted to get my PhD. Maybe now is a good time to start thinking about that. And I had known I wanted to get my PhD since I was young. I've always loved school, loved study, and the more I can learn, the better. So I just started doing a bit of research on different programs that were out there, and really preferred to go international if I could, just to kind of get that different scope of experience. And one of my good friends in the US who is also getting her PhD said, if there's one piece of advice I could give you, it would be to look for a researcher who's doing work in an area that you're interested in, rather than just looking at the program. And so that was really the lens that I applied as I was doing my search, and happened to find someone here in New Zealand who was doing some really interesting stuff in the organizational psychology space. And so just sent an exploratory email, and had put a few feelers out elsewhere as well, and got a really lovely response from her. So I decided to go ahead and apply, and I actually hadn't even heard back when I thought, I'll just take a trip to New Zealand to see if I even like it enough to move there, if by chance I do get in. So I booked a trip to come last May of 2018, and about a week before I got on the plane, I got my acceptance letter. So I came to New Zealand to visit, knowing that it was an option for me to actually move here. And I would say within about 2 to 3 days of being here in Christchurch, I was quite certain that this was the place that I was meant to be for the next step of my journey. So I moved here in August of last year, so almost exactly a year ago.
Wow. And that realization, 2 or 3 days here, do you remember it as a point in time when you made a decision, or was it sort of a growing realization, this is it?
Yeah, I think it was a bit more of a growing realization, but I do remember a moment where I was at this really lovely little Airbnb here in Christchurch, and just doing some journaling and thinking about everything, and trying to imagine myself kind of going about daily life in Christchurch, and thinking, where might I go to get my groceries, and where would I go if I wanted to, go on a walk or a good hike. And I think it was that idea of placing myself in the setting and thinking, oh yeah, this feels right. And I think for so much of my life, I have made decisions based on concrete data, and I'm quite cerebral in that way sometimes, in terms of wanting to have all of the evidence that says, yes, this is a good decision because of X, Y, and Z. Whereas with coming here, I knew it was a good decision for very logical reasons as well, but it was more of a feeling where I trusted my intuition, and I think that was the first step of many of really following that gut instinct, and certainly it's led me to a good place.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I loved hearing these, that sort of story. It's really cool to hear how people make decisions and what brings them to a place. It's fascinating. So what have you been assisting with researching and studying, and what are you doing your own research into now?
Yeah, so my thesis is centered around looking at belonging and connection in organizations. And part of my interest around this is that I'm interested in belonging as a concept in general, and without getting, too neck deep into the research, there was what is called the theory or the hypothesis of belongingness. And that really came to the forefront in 1995 with two psychologists, Baumeister and Leary, who essentially came up with this idea that almost everything we do as a human being is ultimately driven by our need to belong and to connect with other human beings. And so I loved that idea, not only because it bears out in the research, but also because it resonated with me personally. And I thought, yes, that is what makes life meaningful. When I think about when I've been unhappy and when I've been really unhappy, both sides of the coin, happiness, unhappiness, both times they were really tied to either connection or the lack thereof. But at the same time, considering some of my experiences in the corporate world and in the workplace, I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating to take that lens of belongingness and apply it to the workplace? And when I started to do some digging, found that there wasn't really much research done in that space, which sometimes can be a bit of a challenge, but it also suggests that it's an area that's really ripe for digging into.
Maybe opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really good. I love it when this happens on podcasts, but I just interviewed someone named David Clifford on Monday, and we're recording this on a Thursday, so it's really fresh for me. But in that podcast, we, which I uploaded yesterday morning, so I turned it around really quick, but the thing that struck me about what we talked about, because he's talking about education and schools and what might schools of the future look like, but we ended up talking about how important for a child growing up, the foundation of feeling like they belong and a sense of identity is far more important than learning ABC, 1, 2, 3, and that if you can gift a child a sense of belonging, then they're probably going to do pretty well. And that as a guardian or a parent or someone looking after children, that's what you really need to be giving is you belong. You are part of this. And that then, he was feeling, then forms the foundation for whatever it is that they study.
Absolutely.
But you got to get that stuff right. And then we talked a lot about empathy and sort of, not focusing on the traditional academic subjects, but focusing more on love and being able to express your feelings, things that are not traditional class subjects. So it's just interesting that the word belonging really resonates across both of these interviews.
I think that's absolutely critical to think about how that concept of belongingness applies in schools as well. Because even if you go back and consider what are some of the memories that stand out to you the most as a child that were really identity forming, often they did have to do with either inclusion or exclusion, if you really dig down to the root of it. And I think that's often what we see play out, not just in the workplace, but in our personal lives as well, that we carry these stories of who we are as individuals based on those things that happened to us when we were very young that are very deeply tied to the types of relationships that we either had or didn't have and what those dynamics looked like. So I think the more we can address that with children, the fewer issues that we'll see as we become adults and have those struggles.
Yeah, that's really good. So the research that you're doing, you said there's not really that much that's been done. So how do you go about doing research in that area if nobody's really looked at it before?
Yeah, so most of my literature review is really focused on sort of the corollary aspects of belongingness. So, of course, I'm looking at belongingness as a general construct, not just in the workplace, but what does it look like in social groups and things like that. But there is a lot of organizational behavior research around things that are tied to belongingness, just in less obvious ways. So, actually, one of my advisors in my thesis has done a lot of work around loneliness in the workplace.
Right.
So it's a very, very, I think, useful sister to belonging. And so it's been really wonderful to learn from her and see some of the work that she's done on loneliness, and has even developed a scale to measure loneliness in the workplace. So looking at things like that. And then also, there, of course, is a lot about relationships at work and leadership styles and how that can impact things, and more about emotions at work, because just as you were saying with education, I think we're coming to a much greater understanding of just how much that matters, and we're starting to see this shift where before there was a bit of a silo when it came to work. It's like, you kind of drop everything at the door, and now you step through the doors of your workplace, and you're this other person. You're kind of a robot in a way, and you're sort of expected to not have too much emotion. Whereas now I think we have a much more holistic view of ourselves as human beings, and we want to be who we are in every sphere of our lives, including at work, and perhaps even especially at work.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I actually think it's interesting because people often say, oh, how's your work-life balance going? But if you think about that, that's implying that one of them is not good and the other is good. Like that work is just stuff that you get through in order to have a life, and that the balancing is kind of the negative and the positive. But I think, in fact, I've stopped using the term sort of work-life balance and talked more about work-life integration.
Yes.
Because if you can integrate so that your life, the positive stuff, is actually somehow a part of your work, then, I mean, it's cliche, but I guess you'll never work a day in your life, right?
Yeah.
If you're actually passionate about what you're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think you're spot on that the whole idea of work-life balance is becoming a bit of an antiquated term. It doesn't really make sense to look at it in that capacity any longer when, especially with technology and the degree to which we're constantly connected to work, it really has shifted, I think, the extent to which those worlds bleed over into each other. Yeah. And also as we're seeing what a difference relationships in the workplace make. So, when we have a boss or colleagues who we feel like know a bit about who we are and respect us as human beings, I think one of the things that really stood out to me very early on in my leadership days was reading a poll. I think it was done by Gallup, actually. And they said that the number one factor that predicted happiness at work was whether or not someone had a best friend at work. And that really stood out to me because I think often workplaces are focusing on so many other things. You see a lot of these companies like have, slides in the workplace and, snack bars and all these perks that sound really cool. But at the end of the day, how much do they really influence our happiness? Not that much. It's about, when you go to work, is there someone that you're looking forward to seeing who you feel like, they have your back, they know something about you, that you're cared about, respected, and that you're seen for who you are, not just as an employee, but as a person.
I think, is it Brené Brown, I'm pretty sure, talks a lot about this, and hardwired for relationship.
Yeah.
That's kind of fundamentally who we are. It is about relationship. And so if you're divorcing it and, well, I just come here to work on the spreadsheet and these numbers have to add up to 1.47, that's the danger, isn't it? Yeah. So what would be some of your tips, I guess, for encouraging belonging at work, apart from the attitude of gratefulness, which I really liked? But is there anything that's sort of emerging from your research that it's probably still early days, but is there things that would be helpful for people who are listening?
Yeah, great question. I would say ask me in a year because I'll have some data around it then. So I'll just talk briefly about sort of what my approach will be to answering that exact question.
Great.
So ultimately what I want to do is create a model of belongingness that says, what are some of the precursors to belongingness? So if we say that creating a culture of belonging is ultimately what we're after as a workplace, what are some of the things we can put in place, whether it's leadership styles, looking at things like the structural elements of an organization. So are they hierarchical or do they have more of a flat structure? What are the sort of organizing features of a company? And by that, I mean like the nuts and bolts of sort of day-to-day operating procedures. So what does it look like when a new employee comes on board? What does that process look like? What happens when a problem comes up at work? How do they go about problem solving? So all of those sort of operational factors, how do those play into belongingness? And then also looking at individual factors. So is there something outside of anything an organization can do about you or me as an individual that makes us more or less likely to find a sense of belongingness in an organization? And how can companies potentially look at that as they're even screening employees and placing them on certain teams and making sure that they're put in an environment where they'll function best? So that's sort of the initial stage, is saying, let's dig in and figure out what those precursors to belongingness are. And then on the other side, once we have a culture of belongingness, what happens on the other side of it? So what are some of the positive outcomes, the tangible things, like is there an impact on productivity or engagement or tenure or even revenue, all the things that organizations are really looking at as metrics of success. But also giving some heed to the potential negative outcomes. So there is a bit of research on things like good soldier syndrome. So this idea that you can almost have too much belonging in an organization where your loyalty to a team or the organization sort of takes over, your loyalty to yourself or your sense of well-being and your boundaries and things of that nature. So that's sort of looking at the other side. What are some of the outcomes of belongingness?
Which I imagine could be an issue for certain type of organizations, which are social service type organizations where you're doing a mission or a amazing work for a particular group that's really needy.
Yes.
And your identity could become so associated with that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. Well, we'll just have to do another podcast when you're done. Come back on and we'll see where you got to. But it's good to know the process that you're following to.
Yeah. And I will say, just without any of the data yet to back it up, I think just as a former employee and as a human being, to me, one of the most important things that any organization could do is to really create that focus on relationship. Because, as you alluded to with the Brené Brown phrase, hardwired for relationship, that's so true. And when I consider what my own experiences in organizations have been, what made me feel like I was valued and really caused that sense of loyalty was when, I had a boss who was very deeply invested in my success. I had a team around me that I knew on a personal level, not crossing any boundaries, but that, I knew what their families were like. I knew the things that were important to them. And I think sometimes we're so worried about political correctness and those kinds of things that we sort of gloss over the fact that that's ultimately what makes us who we are. And the more we can recognize those things in other people, ultimately, the closer it brings us together and the more likely we are to work on things that actually matter together.
Yeah, that's really good. And the other thing, we're riffing off of each other's thoughts here a lot, but it's good. It's a good riffing, because I'm just thinking, when I went to university and I studied law and other things, there wasn't really a class about empathy, relationship, the importance of communication. Sure, I learned quite a few facts, but the point I'm making is that if we're saying that relationship is really key, then what are we teaching the next generation about communication, about openness, about valuing diversity. Like surely these should be fundamentally, the first year class should be about how do we relate with each other?
Yes.
Different personality types, like that type of thing. I didn't learn until, relatively recently,
Yeah.
but if you go into your boss's office and they are, a different personality to you, you need to have the skills to be able to, communicate effectively
Yeah.
in a way that resonates with them. So
Yeah, and I think ultimately that's what's really going to distinguish organizations and even individuals from one another in the future. Because, as we look at AI and robotics and all of these things, the more technical aspects of the work that we do, regardless of the field, we'll start to obviously see a lot more automation, and we've already seen that start to play out. So computers will be able to do a lot of the thinking for us, but what we can't replace is that human connection and relationship building. And so I think organizations and people who really do that well and place the emphasis on that will really be a leg up. But I think beyond that, beyond looking at sort of the positive outcomes of it, to me, it's also about who is it that you want to be in life? And do you want to be someone who leaves someone feeling a little bit lighter and brighter because of the interaction that they had with you? And I feel like no matter what space you're in, there's no more beautiful legacy you can leave than that.
Which echoes what we talked about before, the welcoming and the smiles and,
Yes.
the attitude of gratefulness, which then has profound impacts on others. Yeah, that's really great. So I'd love to chat a little bit about Unchatter.
Yes.
So what is it? How did it start? And we've had conversations before, so I kind of know, but I'd love for the listeners to understand what it is and also how they can get involved if they're interested.
Yeah, sure. So I guess in its simplest form, Unchatter is an organization that is focused on bringing meaningful connection into the world. And that happens in a couple different ways. So I do work with organizations and actually use some of the research and some of the work that I'm doing in my thesis to help them figure out how to have cultures and teams that ultimately breed more belongingness and connection and have more positive outcomes as a result. I think the more public face of Unchatter is the events that we run. So the first one was in February here in Christchurch, and we've had one every month since then. They've been consistently selling out ever since we had the first one, and now have done a few in Wellington, and we'll actually do the first one in Auckland in September. So at those events, it's really about bringing together people who are longing to have those deeper conversations, but maybe aren't quite sure how to get there. And I would argue that just about every human being out there has that longing. We all do want to connect at a deeper level. We don't really want to be walking around talking about, weather and sports and, all these sort of surface level things that we spend most of our time talking about. And yet we're just not quite sure how to get there. So the Unchatter events are really designed to not only create a container during the event where you can go to those spaces, but also to get some tools that you can take away and have more meaningful conversations in your everyday life as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and a big shout out to Exchange in Preston, because I think you're hosting them there in Christchurch, aren't you? And as you know, I've started something called Impact Lunches, which is basically addressing the same need that you're talking about, the idea that we can actually get people together in a room and have more, deeper conversations and get past the surface. So how do you cultivate that attitude of going a bit deeper with people? Like, what are some of the ways that you're approaching that tricky issue? I
think one of the most important things is that we put a lot of emphasis on creating emotional safety. So understanding that anytime you're asking people to be a bit more vulnerable and venture into territory that they're perhaps not accustomed to going in their everyday lives, it's critical that you really set the stage for that in a meaningful way. So there's a few things that we do to really undergird that sense of safety. One of them is that we have a set of what I call party principles. And so it's just some basic rules that get us all on the same page with how we move together through the event. There's also a quiet space. So if at any point someone feels a bit overwhelmed by the conversation or just wants to get away, they can step into that space. And then perhaps the most impactful is that we have a team of connectors. And those are people who are participating in the evening and really engaged in the exercises. But at the same time, they sort of have a special eye out for anyone who might be feeling uncomfortable or just need a conversation buddy or an extra boost to really help them feel engaged and comfortable in the space.
That's great. So that's helping to facilitate the looking around the room and helping.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is that because the events are really guided, it's not as if we're just asking people to, show up and start having deep conversations. So they've been very thoughtfully curated in terms of even the sequence of exercises that we do. So starting with, a bit more levity, doing just a basic meditation to kind of help people drop into that space and create that energy of togetherness and presence. We also ask people to check their cell phones at the door or leave them at home. So obviously that makes a huge difference. But I think just moving through some of those stages, if you will, gradually brings people to this place where they can feel safe and comfortable talking about things in a deeper way. And it's generally in smaller groups as well. So I think that also creates a bit more intimacy and that willingness to really open parts of yourself that you maybe don't in everyday life.
And I guess in a way what you're hoping is that you're modeling this attitude of asking a few questions and going a bit deeper with people. Therefore, the next day or the next day or the next day, they might actually go up to a colleague or go up to a friend and, have something that goes a bit below the surface.
Yes. Yeah. So at the end of every event, I always assign a couple pieces of homework, and it's always centered around thinking about some of those interactions that you have on a regular basis that typically are occupied by small talk, and really tasking the people who attend to use some of the tools that they learn. There's something called neon quill feathers that is just kind of an easy way of remembering some of the tools that we give them to take away. So using some of those tools in those interactions that they have on a regular basis. And as with anything, the more we exercise it, the easier it becomes. And I think perhaps the most important thing to remember is that as much anxiety and angst that we can hold sometimes about having those conversations, just to know that other people are feeling the same way too. So we want to connect, we want to have more meaningful conversations. And so opening that door to vulnerability and to depth, it gives other people permission to step through and occupy that space with you.
That's good. Yeah, I love that word, vulnerability. Brene Brown talks about it a lot.
Yes.
The willingness to be vulnerable, to show your true self.
Yes.
Not to have the mask that's up. Well, what we'll do, we can put things in the show notes. So if people are listening, they'll be able to go in and then click and find out. And it sounds like the events are going pretty regularly, right? So
yes. Yeah, once a month.
There will be one coming up soon, whenever you listen to this.
Yes. Yep. So the next one in Christchurch is September 13th. And as I mentioned, they always sell out. So depending on when this gets posted, if we're not already sold out, it's probably a good idea to get tickets
But
soon.
come back next month if it's sold out, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Well, I'd like to finish off, but before we do that, we started with a poem, and I'm just curious, can you just tell us what it is about poetry that you love? Because you were very kind. You brought me a book by Annie Dillard, who we talked about this before, that she's one of my favorite writers. And she's, for example, she's written found poems where she'll read a book and then kind of pull out words to make a found poem. But from you, clearly poetry does play a role in your life. I'm just curious about that for you. What does it mean for you? Yeah,
well, I think I've always been a lover of words, and I'm sure that just comes from being a reader at a very young age. But I think there's something quite magical about poetry in that it taps into this sense of emotion that we can't quite get in any other way. And so when I think about poems that have really moved me or that resonate with me, Mary Oliver is a great example. She's like Annie Dillard in many ways, in that, you know, they take very seemingly ordinary situations or objects in some cases and really see them as sacred. And I think for me, that's reflective of the way that I live my everyday life, is looking at, you know, every act that you do as something that's sacred, whether it's, you know, making the bed or washing the dishes or connecting with someone, no matter how big or small. I think ultimately that's really what makes us human and helps us to have a fully human experience, is seeing all of those little bits and pieces of everyday life as sacred in their own way. And I think poetry taps into that in just this really ethereal way that nothing else can quite touch.
It's amazing, isn't it, when you can summarize on one page or even half a page a concept that you couldn't explain in a book.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. I'll actually, I'll throw out a Rumi quote that I think captures exactly what you're saying. There's a line of one of his poems that says, "The whole business of love is to drown in the sea." And when I first read that, I thought, oh my goodness, if there ever was a description of what love is, I can't think of a better one than that. And so to me, that is just a shining example of what poetry and weaving together words in this way can really do. Is it just, it touches a part of you that that's really hard to express in any other way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I love writing. Therefore, probably I love writing poetry. And one of the things I try to do is for every guest to write a poem for the guest, because it's a way for me to sort of cement that conversation that we have. Because I love every conversation I've had on this podcast. I've just enjoyed each one. And so it's a way to say that was sacred, that was special. And here's the key things that from, you know, the lenses on from my end, here's what really stood out. And I feel like it really crystallizes in a way that nothing else could.
Yeah,
you know?
that's
like it's one thing to send an email and say thanks very much, but anyway.
That's a really beautiful practice, and I think it actually comes back to what we were talking about with connection. And I think as much as connection comes naturally to us as human beings, there is also an element of it that if we want it to be truly deep and meaningful and resonant, there is a part of it that needs to be cultivated and considered very carefully. And so a practice like that, or something I often do before I'm, you know, meeting a friend for coffee or whatever interaction I'm going to have, is just taking, even if it's a minute in my car, to maybe do a meditation and think about that person. And if it's someone I know, to consider, you know, what did we talk about last time? What might they be going through? What might they need in terms of, you know, my energy and presence today? And then doing something similar at the end of that interaction, whether it's, you know, journaling or just doing a brief meditation to really seal that interaction. And exactly like you said, to treat it as sacred, because I think every interaction that we have with a human being, whether it's, you know, the cashier at the supermarket or a deep conversation with a friend, there is something really incredibly beautiful and sacred about it. Yeah,
the words that spring to mind for me are being present, being mindful, and just cultivating the, you know, I guess it's acting with purpose.
Yes.
Approaching our lives with purpose. And that's sort of what has come through for me in lots of what we've talked about, you know. So it's been really great. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been awesome. I knew that we were going to talk about a lot of deep things, and we did. So that's great. And if people are interested in Unchatter and finding out more, we'll put some links in so they can find them. But thank you so much for your time and coming and talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was a pleasure.
No problem. Great. Cool.